everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Matt Eldridge, and I'm a Policy Program Manager within the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute. Before we jump into the webinar, just some quick housekeeping notes. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted online afterwards, accessible both from the event page and from Urban's YouTube channel. The event page also has all the bios of today's speakers. Participants are all automatically muted, but please share any questions or comments you have in the Q&A box at any time. Questions will be answered after the panel discussion at the end of the webinar. Please also join the conversation online by tweeting about this event using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for what promises to be an engaging conversation on how impact investing field leaders can effectively engage with federal policymaking in order to support the market's growth and impact. Today's conversation comes at an interesting moment in time, to put it mildly. We live in a very different world than we did 12 or 14 months ago. The pandemic and a reinvigorated movement for racial justice have forced us and our society to confront inequities and systemic racism like never before. We've seen clearly how unjust policies, institutions, and systems can fuel divergent health and economic outcomes to the detriment of vulnerable communities and to us all. But with the ongoing vaccination rollout, nascent conversations on an economic recovery from COVID-19, and a new political landscape in Washington, there's reason for optimism that these issues can be confronted and we can build a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable society and economy. But addressing deep-rooted challenges like systemic racism and climate change will require leveraging resources, expertise, and ideas from all parts of society. Impact investing, which does just that, is one part of the solution. And federal policies, if carefully developed, can facilitate these efforts by boosting the flow and effective targeting of impact capital, encouraging mutually beneficial partnerships between public and private entities, and strengthening the impact investing ecosystem. Today's speakers will explore these themes, sharing their thoughts on how field leaders can effectively engage with policymaking. First up, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Laura Tomasco, to share some practical strategies and tips for federal policy engagement from our new brief. Laura, over to you.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to share a few highlights from our policy brief, Strategies for Advancing Impact Investing Through Public Policy. I co-authored this brief along with Matt, who you just heard from, Brett Theotis, who will moderate the discussion with our panelists, and Jane Park. We are so grateful to the Tipping Point Fund on Impact Investing, a project of the New Venture Fund for support of the brief and webinar. We wrote this guide because we are living in a moment defined by a myriad of crises that lay bare the structural, racial, economic, and environmental inequities that our country faces. By no means is impact investing a silver bullet to end inequities, but fostering an economic system that values social and environmental outcomes alongside financial ones can be part of the solution. We have heard from field leaders that impact investing can play a role in small business recovery, in climate change, in affordable housing, in racial justice and wealth building, among others. We see this moment of political transition as a key time to take stock of relationships with policymakers and think about how to work together to pursue policy objectives. When we're talking about impact investing, whether with policymakers or family members, we often get caught up on explaining what impact investing is. This can lead to confusion that detracts from the ultimate goal of communicating what impact investing can help to achieve. The purpose of our guide is to both make the case for engaging with policymakers and also to present strategies for effectively communicating and messaging about impact investing to policymakers. I will first define what we mean by impact investing and by engaging policymakers, and then I will share our proposed messaging strategies. So in this paper, we adopt the broad definition of impact investing put forward by the Initiative for Responsible Investment that describes impact investing as an investment approach that considers more than traditional financial metrics. This includes both investors that incorporate environmental social governance, or ESG, factors into decision-making, as well as investors who deploy financial tools to intentionally create positive social and environmental outcomes. When we write about policy engagement, we describe a wide range of activities that inform the development, implementation, and improvement of federal policies. A few examples from the brief: educating members of Congress about a particular issue, responding to public comment periods through the Federal Register, supporting policy research to identify what works, and pursuing policy implementation partnership opportunities with federal agency officials. While these engagements sometimes result in the policy outcome that field leaders hope to achieve, sometimes they don't, but these engagements can still help build relationships between policymakers and practitioners that can inform better policy down the road. So regardless of the policy engagement approach you pursue, we suggest 7 tips for creating an effective messaging strategy about impact investing, which you will see on the slide here. So number 1, lead with impact and ditch the jargon. Because the field is diverse and it can be complicated to understand, field leaders should focus on the gains that impact investing can achieve. Number 2, adapt to current events and priorities. While policy change can feel slow, in moments of crisis, it can happen really quickly. Being able to mobilize and adapt to the needs of today, such as combating the COVID crisis, will increase the likeliness that what you have to say aligns with policymaker priorities. Number 3, connect to place. This makes impact investing real. It shows what it can accomplish on a tangible level that people can visualize, like creating full-time jobs with good benefits or safe and affordable housing units. Number 4, use storytelling and narrative framing to contextualize data. Our panel is going to go into this in a lot more detail, but simply put, think about delivering messages with content that resonates with the heart and facts that make the case for that action. Number 5, share data and evidence to persuade. Local data can be a compelling way to show how a policy can improve outcomes for people in a particular place. And national data can make a persuasive economic case for taking action on issues like climate change and closing the racial wealth gap. Number 6, point to precedent and time-tested models. Policymakers need to be careful with taxpayer dollars. Knowing that a program has been tested outside of government or that there's a federal precedent for that program can lower the perceived risk to policymakers. And number 7, highlight competitive advantages. Impact investing is a bipartisan tool that can appeal to a wide range of policymakers. It can leverage private dollars and meet consumer demand for stable returns. So these are our 7 messaging strategies. In our brief, we also recommend anticipating some challenges. I've already spoken about the first challenge, getting caught up on definitions. And the second challenge, relatedly, is expecting policymaker familiarity with the tool. Impact investing is a bit of a hybrid between 2 activities that policymakers likely have done, making a charitable contribution and investing to generate a financial return. But don't expect personal experience with impact investing itself. The third challenge is generalizing the field. Impact investors include individuals and institutions with distinct motivations and perspectives spanning Main Street to Wall Street and foundations to pensions. There are countless models and permutations of expectations on returns, impact, and exits. Impact investors typically agree that they can advance the common good through impact investment tools, but they often disagree about how much financial return they sacrifice. The last challenge is neglecting the broader political, economic, and social paradigms and context. Impact investing policies are embedded in our country's political and economic debates. Policymakers on the left might be more skeptical of the financial services industry and be concerned about privatizing services, and right-leaning policymakers might oppose government interference in the market and additional regulations and standards. The last thought from our brief that I will leave you with before turning to our wonderful panel is the importance of working with and through others. Field leaders will benefit from working with associations or in alliances, partnerships, and movements to amplify messages, to demonstrate a broad base of support, and to reach different audiences. And there are opportunities to influence and inform policy discourse through platforms outside of government. This can include hosting discussions with experts, writing op-eds, and even integrating impact investing into the mainstream through avenues like pop culture. The more understood and accepted the goals of impact investing become, the more likely it is for demand to increase. And the more likely it is that policymakers will have a baseline understanding of how it can help promote an economic system that advances the common good and addresses inequities. With that, I will turn to my colleague, Brett Theodos, co-author of the paper, Senior Fellow and Director of the Community Economic Development Hub at Urban.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Excited to turn to the panel and welcome three really remarkable leaders in this field. And we will do little intros as part of the comments, so I'm going to skip that right now and get into the questions. So let's start with Lisa. You have had a terrific career, really accomplished inside and outside of government. And you have focused on broader trends in racial and economic and social justice and community development. And now as chairperson at Apollo Management, you're advising on impact management strategies. And so I wonder, in our current moment, how do you think impact investors should best move ahead to meet the needs of today as well as of tomorrow?
Thank you so much, Brett, and it's great to see you, and really appreciate Urban Institute having pulled together this policy brief and pulling together the panel today. Really excited to join such an esteemed group in talking about impact investing and policy. I think, the problems of today have really been highlighted by the, double whammy of a pandemic, a huge public health global crisis, and the economic downturn. And so, the problems that we're facing are ever bigger and require big solutions. And I think one of the things that investors need to focus on is the objectives and the solutions that you're looking at to solve these problems. To be really clear upfront about your strategic intent. And for those of you who may have done impact investing for a period of time or involved in public policy around impact investing, you probably are very familiar with the concept of intentionality in impact investing. And it's part of a definition that's used by some is that for an investment to be an impact investment, there must be intentionality. And that intentionality is around setting objectives up front around your strategic goals, strategic impact goals, and thinking about what is the solution that you're aiming for to solve a problem at hand, whether that's in education or health or in the economy. And, I think that there are a lot of great tools and resources out there for investors and public policy professionals to draw upon in thinking about good impact management and how do you set your objectives to solve some of these really what can sometimes seem like entrenched problems that will require these big solutions. And I would point people to tools like the operating principles for impact management that have been created by the IFC. And the number one principle of their 9 principles is to set strategic impact objectives. And we're a signatory to those principles at Apollo Global Management for our new impact platform. And I wasn't always a fan of intentionality. I said in the early days as people were starting to use the term impact investing and this idea of intentionality came up, I wondered at first, like, why do we care if you are creating impact on purpose, right? As long as you're creating impact, isn't that good for people and the planet? And the challenge with not having intentionality is it's easy to abandon impact objectives if you're not clear about them up front and very committed to them up front and willing to track and monitor your results and your metrics. And intentionality really demands that you do all those things throughout the life cycle of an investment. So I'll stop there. I'm really excited to be part of this panel and to talk more about these thorny issues and challenges in both the field of impact investing and public policy solutions to help to address our challenges. Thank you.
That's terrific. I'm reminded of a quote by Winston Churchill that it's good to have a strategy and also occasionally check if we're working towards it. I'm not doing justice to the quote, but I love the intentionality start. Annie, let's go to you. You have had leadership positions in several spaces in community development sector and impact investing. Recently leading the CDFI fund, have been at a couple CDFIs, including now as Chief Operating Officer at LISC. So tell us from your vantage points in and out of government, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for impact investing in this moment?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Brett, and thank you, Laura. Thank you for the brilliant piece that you wrote, which is chock full of insights and very practical tips and strategies. You know, in any conversation of impact investing that I participate in, I like to start by just talking for a minute about the impact investing spectrum. And Laura kind of laid this out in her opening remarks that, this industry includes many types of investors, many types of investments. I always like to distinguish a little bit because especially when we're talking about public policy, I think the work that I have been involved in for my whole career has taken place, if you will, on one end of the impact investing spectrum. And I would describe that spectrum as on the one end, you have folks who want to do well and do good. And there's not really a trade-off between doing well and doing good. And from the economist's perspective, that's, there are information asymmetries that, prevent us from, knowing how to do well and do good at the same time, and not having to make a trade-off. The work that I've been doing in community development is really anti-poverty work, and it's trying to get at inequality. And some of those are systemic things that are built into our financial system. There are systemic inequalities, and that's what we're trying to get at. And there is a trade-off. There often is a trade-off between risk and return, and there's a need for subsidy. So if you think about affordable housing, that's a very easy example because you can readily compute why it takes public subsidy to make a deal pencil out. So that's the space that I've worked in, and so I think public policy is absolutely essential on that end of the spectrum because markets do fail, and capital doesn't flow, and that's easy enough to see. And then the question is why, and how can we use public policy tools to bring together public purpose and private investment in a way that that jumpstarts a market and makes it functional in a community. So I think that the kinds of things that I have seen work really well. Of course, I ran the CDFI fund, so and Lisa Hall was actually in the Clinton administration in the days when the CDFI fund was created. So, and the New Markets Tax Credit Program as well. So I think those tools have been particularly impactful in supporting the growth of a whole sector that is working at the intersection of public and private investment, trying to address inequality in all of its forms.
That's great. Thank you, Annie. And plug for the audience, Annie goes into further detail on some of these concepts in a piece in Impact Alpha that she just put out. So check that out. But Amy, I want to bring you into the conversation. You are an expert in communications and strategy with an eye towards systems change. And I've been told that I may talk a lot, but that's not necessarily the same thing as good communication strategy. So I really want to bring your expertise into this. You focus on local and regional economic building, impact investing, social justice. And given the disruption that we're living through right now, what do you see as the opportunity for movement building? And are there approaches that impact investors in particular should take? And should they seek to connect with both sides of the aisle? Or is that less important nowadays? Is it less possible nowadays? Bring us up to speed.
Thank you. And just want to echo gratitude to the Urban Institute for convening us and for these amazing co-panelists that I'm as excited to listen to as everyone else. Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't feel like I can speak on behalf of all movements. The movements I see, I think in this moment are recognizing to some extent the risks of inaction and the risk of not collaborating more actively. Certainly we can see that with the pandemic. We can see it in Texas right now. I mean, not doing something is sometimes even more dangerous than taking some things that are perceived as risks. But I think what is exciting is that more and more people are seeing that all these issues are connected. And movements, while they may have often very sophisticated theories of change at work within their own movement, I think have been less capable of, frankly, of just prioritizing cross-movement activity and collaboration. So I think we're seeing a lot more of that. A couple of examples, you have, faith-based leaders like Reverend William Barber and, leading something like the Poor People's Campaign, bringing together, a range of different movements that are all aligned. We also have seen like incredible activity, trying to support this administration embracing the idea of an office for racial equity sitting within the White House. And that's building on years of grassroots movement building as well, and a number of different collaborators. On the narrative side, I think there's also increasing awareness that there's a lot of activity, frankly, that dominates, and I'm thinking now more about grassroots and kind of mainstream thinking. More and more narrative folks are really looking at the intersection of pop culture and how that influences and normalizes ideas that might seem, again, fringe, but are in, there's plenty of solutions and models to follow and build on. So that's super exciting. I mean, one project that I'd encourage folks to look into has been led by a group called Culture Hack. They've kind of harnessed big data and very broad listening across lots of channels just to understand patterns and themes and narratives that work and narratives that also can be weaponized. But there's a lot of data coming into formation about ways that narrative shift and culture shift can support creating the conditions for policy shift and to support policymakers being able to respond to more mainstream demands and activity. In terms of, hopes for bipartisan, collaboration on this type of an impact investing, I mean, I would say for better or worse, certainly, I would say for worse at this moment, everyone's constituents are hurting, to be honest. And I think the promise of impact investing is to really tangibly improve people's lives. And of course, that's what storytelling needs to really, I think, focus on. We can talk a little bit more about that as we go deeper into the panel. But the last thing I would just offer, because I think it's something that is sort of the latent opportunity really is to continue with this collaboration, but really for funders to prioritize that kind of coordination, cross movements, cross coalitions, and being intentional, of course, about working both an outside game, creating that grassroots pressure in the mainstream space, as well as continuing to do good policy work and the inside game and think about long-term outcomes that we're all working towards. So I'll pause there, but thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. We're getting into it now. This is awesome. Annie, I want to bring it back to you. I'm cognizant of the reality that impact investors have day jobs. And those day jobs may not include policy engagement, or at least they may not think they can or should include that. And so I'd like for you to help us understand why policy matters for impact investing, and what meaningful contributions policy can make to impact investing.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think, first of all, if we're putting first principles first and we really do want to make the world a better place, then we have to look at how we're maximizing the tools that are at our disposal, right? And impact investing, the investment alone is not challenging necessarily the system that is creating the outcomes to begin with. And in order to get at systems change, we have to engage with policy, because it's the policy context that's setting the framework for the creation of inequality to begin with. So impact investing by itself alone is nice, but it's really not going to get to the outcomes of really moving the needle on creating more broadly shared prosperity. So I think that that's the compelling case, that if you really want to meet your mission, this is an important component. And then I think with respect to how does one do that, I think that's what partnerships are for. And there are lots of organizations that are out there that have come together. If you look at the Impact Investing Alliance, the U.S. Alliance for Impact Investors, I mean, the kind of work that that you all are doing at Urban and others who are there to promote policy solutions. And I think investors can support that. They can support it in many ways. They can support it, by being members. They can support it by activating around the initiatives that get created, and contributing to that conversation. And it doesn't have to be a full-time job, but it should be prioritized in terms of weighing in and using whatever levers you have. I mean, we all have the lever, except if you live in DC and it's taxation without representation and we need to become a state. Other than that, if everywhere else, you can go to your elected official, and you talked about one of the strategies being localizing the impact, and that's where your voice can be so powerful, and it's not that hard to do, and it's really quite fun to do, to promote the work that you're doing to your policymakers and making it real for them, because that's all politics really is local. And I've lots of examples of that from my time at the CDFI fund, and seeing that in action and working. So I think that we have to get serious about the broader outcomes and the systemic change we're seeking, and we can't do it without policy engagement.
That's terrific. And perhaps demystifying or normalizing it a bit more, I'm sure you'd agree with this, Annie, but in my experience, policymakers are eager to hear from people who know on the ground what's happening and what should be done.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. So, Lisa, we heard from Annie earlier about a continuum of impact investing. And I wonder if you're, in your experience in and out of government, how you think we can help, how impact investors can create or reform programs like perhaps we heard about the new market tax credits or low-income housing tax credits that allow better provision of capital into communities. And just pushing this a little harder to make us wrestle with the challenges here, I wonder how we do that without entrenching inequality further. If we look, for example, at the biggest beneficiaries of 529 plans, Roth IRAs, donor advised funds, and my research documenting who benefits most from opportunity zone projects. It's not necessarily always low and moderate income people when we think about policy. So how do we get what we want and need for people?
Right. So, you know, policy and government funding and government incentives are such important drivers to the behavior of the private sector in terms of private sector investment. And so I think we have to be more focused on building into our policy, whether it be regulatory policy or whether we're talking about legislation, but actually building in the community benefit, right? Because the private sector will respond to the levers that the government, whether that be federal or local, put in place, right? And so you can see that with tools that have been mentioned today, like new markets, tax credits, where I think you could go even another step around, you know, how proceeds are used to drive more small business investing. And we can build these into the regulations and the legislation itself. I think an example that we're going to see in this administration is their influence over climate investment, right? And, you know, it's very hard to argue after the last couple of days with, I think the numbers like 80% of the country is covered in snow, right? It's hard to imagine that people aren't going to see a need for climate action. And the government is going to be a really important driver. Public policy is going to be a really important influencer of how we execute on climate action and how we make those investments, and making sure that there is equity and justice and balance in the benefit to communities where these investments are being made. And I frankly think that type of community benefit has to be written in. And it is part of where I started around the intentionality and the objectives that you set on impact. In an ideal world, and we very much believe in collinearity at Apollo, what works for impact is also going to work for financial performance, right? And the best impact models, whether they be climate solutions or economic solutions to the many injustices we see in this country and even globally, that policy can help to shape and drive the actual benefit that ends up going to communities. And in the best models, that the impact and the financial performance are going to be really symbiotic, right? They're going to fuel one another. They're going to build on each other. And that if the policies are created in a way that keeps the communities as an important stakeholder, then the private sector is going to respond to that.
It's really important. Thank you for lifting that up. I want to encourage folks, we're going to reserve the last 10 minutes of the webinar for your questions that I'll filter into the panelists. So go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A, and we will curate some of them and lift them up. But next, I wanted to dig in on a couple of the 7 strategies that we put in the brief that we released. And we're not going to have time to do justice to all of them. But let's start with the storytelling one, and also narrative framing to contextualize data and to help connect it to a specific place. I'm wondering, Amy, you've done some writing and research on storytelling and narrative framing. Could you help us to think about that in the context of messaging around impact investing?
Yeah, one of the, I'll start with a story, which is early in my work starting to support communications around impact investing. I was working actually at the time with Calvert Foundation, now Calvert Impact Capital, formerly Lisa's organization, but I was exposed to this study. It was shared with me, the study, a brain scan study that looked at what happens when humans are exposed to philanthropic messages, giving away your money to do good. Literally all the happy parts of our brains light up. We get a dopamine release literally when we give money away. Then the brain was scanned after being exposed to financial services messages, messages about investing, messages about delayed gratification. And all of the happy parts of our brains shut down, and our reptilian brain, our amygdala, is what is activated. And so I offer that because at least for me, it was very humbling to just recognize how complicated our brains are when we are trying to fuse these activities that don't feel like they can support one another. And also just to recognize that we have trained ourselves that way. We can obviously choose to evolve our understanding, but we will have, and certainly policymakers, anyone who's sitting across the table from you, will have these kind of deep reactions that may or may not be rational. And so when we bring in a tool like storytelling, and we start to connect with people's hearts around an emotional chord, there has to very quickly be an opportunity to follow that up with data and numbers, and to make sure these two things are happening constantly and back and forth. And dropping, as has been said a number of times, dropping into place, getting as granular as possible, making sure that the policymakers sitting at the table really can understand how this looks on the ground for their voters and their folks. So, from a storytelling standpoint, emphasizing proven models that just need more fuel, that need more dollars to grow them, solutions that exist, especially obviously it's very grounded in place. And the other thing I would just say is it kind of, I'm sure it maps in some ways to the brain scan studies. We have the dominant paradigm has standards around risk and return that we've adopted and assumed and accepted. But I think when you start to look at the fact that most of our policies just assume all of the risk will be borne by the people who are least well served right now, and somehow we preference more digits in bank accounts is arbitrary, frankly. I mean, it's not without its history, but we can choose a different thing. We can choose to start to have a more sophisticated analysis around, I think, risk and return, especially as we're dealing with, the urgency of the crises that exist, but also keeping our eye on horizons, where, we obviously, we want to use policy as much as possible as a tool toward obviously advancing the common good in the way that I think the impact investing holds promise, great promise. But yeah, I'll pause there because I know my panelists have so much wisdom on this too. So yeah.
That's great. And I'm reminded of, messaging strategies. We were talking in our prep call about Claire Miller's mantra of no data without stories and no stories without data. So Annie, Lisa, what have you found effective in communicating with policymakers, as, having sat on that side of the table and the other, what works? And I guess if you could couple that with, what do you want from the impact investing field? Do they need to just vote 10% of every FTE to this, or is it really okay to highly specialize it within, one function or person? Help us make it practical a little bit here in terms of what you would like to see the field advance in.
Well, Brett, I'm glad to take the first part of that question, which is what works. And I think, we really do have shared humanity, right? Like people, I believe, buy into this concept that, one planet, we're all here together, and everybody cares about something. And the key with storytelling is figuring out what matters to groups of people. And sometimes it's place-based, as you guys have outlined in your brief, right? Sometimes it's about where you're from. I'm from Baltimore originally and feel deeply connected to that city. And so for place-based investing opportunities in Baltimore, that's a real appeal. And telling that story, not just to investors, but also thinking about how place resonates with policymakers, I think is really important. And sometimes it's not place. Sometimes it's a population of people, right? Sometimes it's a gender focus. right? People really care, and it's not just women who care about women. I think that there are plenty of men with, daughters and relationships with women who understand that women haven't gotten opportunities in the economy and how important that is to expanding the pie, right? Is to making sure we're optimizing our economy in all ways, is to be inclusive around women's roles as business owners, and contributors to the economy. And so sometimes it's gender. But I think finding those issue areas, finding the connection, whether it's with place or community of people, is really key to the storytelling. And that's true with investors as it is true with the policymakers.
So I would agree with that 100%. And I would add on to it that the other thing that I think it's important to remember when you are meeting with policymakers is that their time is so fractured. And so you have to be really succinct and well prepared. And when I was at the CDFI fund, I think we found a very successful strategy to use maps, and so this is very tactical. But if we would use a map with numbers, and we had the stories, and a lot of times, particularly for House members, they knew their districts. They knew every block of their district. And so when you could show them a map with little dots for everywhere that a CDFI had made an investment in their district, that lit up you could see the dopamine hits going. And to follow that up to say, yes, this X number of dollars have been invested there. I think that's partly why the CDFI fund has such strong bipartisan support. And I think impact investing is a similar story, and why the story is not a hard sell. We saw, in fact, one of my first visits up to the Hill was to a congressperson who had just been elected and was an avowed Tea Party person. So I thought, oh, gee, how's this going to go? Because my assumption was that the congressperson would not be interested in government spending and programs. But we used that strategy, and lo and behold, when he looked at the map, he said, oh yeah, I know that hotel where a New Markets investment went in, and I know that family. And so there was a connection, and he became a supporter of the New Markets program. And somebody inside his constituency said, we think you should support this. So you really can convert legislators to the cause, and stories and data is really powerful.
I wonder, the potential of the impact investing sector is big money, right? A lot bigger than we're currently seeing flow through in some ways. And I'm wondering if there's anything that needs to be done. Are there any barriers or skepticism or reputation issues, real or perceived, that impact investors need to address as they're addressing policymakers? Anyone want to take that up?
I would say yes. And that's what I wrote about in Impact Alpha today. Is I pointed out what I think are 3 things that impact investors need to focus on. The first is moving from shareholder to stakeholder capitalism. That term has been coined. At least it was in the U.S. Impact Investment Alliance report that they put out a couple months ago. And the Business Roundtable has endorsed this too. So the business world is at least starting to talk the talk that we can't just be focused on shareholder return. And that leads to, we can't just be focused on short term. And so we know in the community investment world, we need partners who will stick with us for the long run, because this stuff was a long time in the making. And these are structural inequalities built into our system that have to be dismantled. And it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen with a flip of a switch, and it doesn't happen with capital alone. There's a lot more that has to go into it. So we need patient investors. And we also, the third thing I pointed out is we need investors to look more carefully at their risk reward ratio, because we think that most conventional lenders and conventional formulas and conventional thinkers, even among policymakers, I saw this when I was inside government, there are assumptions we make about the communities and the people we serve that simply are not true. And the CDFI field has proven the credit worthiness of communities and people who are left at the margins. So that has been put to rest. Now we need the products that are shaped in a way that work for those communities and those people. And being driven by short-term returns and the need for liquidity to flow and reflow very fast, is a killer.
And just to follow on that point, because we've got to get to scale. And I was flipping through the Q&A a little bit, and there was a great question in there from my dear friend, Andrea Levere, who led Prosperity Now for many years, about supporting the investees, right? So basically supporting the intermediaries that do this work. And, it's been very different for me at Apollo, the type of scale that we operate at. And one of the ways I think to get at impact investing at scale and to draw upon the resources of these very large financial institutions who, because of the scale at which we're operating, have to do things in large ticket sizes, in large check sizes, is to think about how you aggregate. So how, as a community, and how do policymakers figure out ways to align private capital with supporting the intermediaries, so they can then be aggregators of small business loans, of real estate investments, and they can aggregate in a way that then big investors who are interested in the impact and also interested in financial return can then invest efficiently at scale into aggregated products. So I completely agree, Annie. We've got to be creative in how we're designing and thinking about products and structures that can then be leveraged with regulation. They can be leveraged through subsidies, tax incentives that then enable large players like Apollo Global Management to come in and invest in an aggregate vehicle.
Great. This is terrific. We're getting so many good questions. Apologies, we're not going to have time for all of them. We will put the personal cell phone numbers of all the panelists in the chat so you can follow up directly. Joking, but we'll get through as many as we can. Amy, let's go to you with a question on how do we get coherent and consistent messaging for policy engagement when the impact investing space is fractured around strategies, approach, theory of change?
Oh, I wish it were unique to impact investing. I feel like that's the big question. I feel like for almost every movement that's struggling to build power right now. I mean, I don't have kind of a silver bullet on it, other than honestly, I just think we need to start doing the hard work of weaving together our efforts and continuing to build long-term relationships and collaboration together. It was one thing that I appreciated too, as in the brief was pointed out, was how, I mean, I think of lobbying, similar to how I'm sure a lot of us think of like capital raising. It's really about getting to the next conversation, just continuing the conversation and building a relationship over time. I feel like that kind of coalition building just needs to continue to happen, and recognize that your issue might not always be the issue that you're leading with, in part based on whatever context is happening and unfolding at the time. So yeah, I wish, I mean, honestly, if I hadn't answered that question, I think, hopefully we'd be living in a different reality, but it is the question. And it's just going to require ongoing relationship building and trust building. And these are not necessarily the easiest things during a pandemic, at a time where we can't be in proximity to build that trust. But my hope is, and I see it, and I participate in lots of different spheres of activities where I'm seeing a lot more people expanding out to the next adjacent sphere of activity. And I just think we need to keep seeing more and more of that. But I'd love some, yeah, Annie, did you have something? Sorry. Too.
Well, no, I don't have,
Oh,
I don't have a good answer for that, but I was just flipping through the questions too and thinking about like, what do we have to be optimistic about? And I do think we are in a moment of optimism with respect to, when I think about one of the funds we created at LISC this past year, the Black Economic Development Fund, that has investments from Netflix and Square and PayPal and a bunch of organizations who are wanting to, corporations that are wanting to step into this space. And so there's momentum there. And I think they're responding to a moment that's not just a moment. It's, they've waded into a very big issue, and it's our job to try to convert them to the long game and not just be in the short game. But we do have people stepping into the space. And a year ago, if you had asked me, could we even create something called the Black Economic Development Fund and get those actors in, so I don't think we would have guessed that this is where the world would have gone. But here we are. And so it is an opportunity to bring more actors into our space, because the world is changing fast for everybody, and the instability that is a result of economic inequality and climate change doesn't make for a very great business environment either. So I think that there are more minds that are going to come to the table to think about solutions. And fortunately, we have been working on these solutions for a long time. So I think that we should get ready for scale.
Yeah. And I would just briefly build on that too, to say that, one of the things that's interesting, and one of the, some of the work that I'm privileged to be part of, and like all of you too, I have access to a lot of, sit in conversations with folks who are obviously in traditional Wall Street. They're starting to look at impact investing. And they're also at the same time aware that with the racial wealth gap where it sits, with inequality getting worse thanks to this pandemic too, financial services firms are like, you know what, our business model doesn't work without customers. And if no one has money, our business doesn't work. And so I think there's also this existential, challenge within the dominant paradigm that is converging with all the movement work that we've been doing. And as Annie says, all the solutions that have been modeled and piloted, which are ready for commercial capital to be absorbed into. So hopefully the convergence doesn't have to hurt too much, and we can kind of step toward it a little bit more than we react to it coming at us, but it's another opportunity.
I'd like to go next to a question around priorities. And it could mean priorities in terms of issue areas, but I even mean more around how to engage. We've got local level policy, we've got state level policy.
Yeah.
At the federal level, there's regulatory work, not just new legislation. And so is there any spaces that you see as especially high on the cost benefit ratio calculation, where you would really encourage people to dig in? Anybody?
I think that that's a great question. And I think I'm biased because my public service has been at the federal level. But I think federal leadership matters in just about every issue area, whether it is health, whether it's education, affordable housing, economic development. I think at the federal level, there is both a responsibility and a role for leadership that then gets followed by, states and localities. And, it has its critics for sure, and I understand that, but you look at what happened with the Opportunity Zone legislation. And that was really set at a federal level, and it was mandated to states in a way that they came in and followed, right? And also drove down to very local levels where you saw localities putting together public-private partnerships to invest in these zones. And so I think, particularly as we have this new administration in place, that there are just tremendous opportunities for the work of impact investing. And I do want to call out, because I think it's so extraordinary that the National Economic Council is now being led by someone who came out of sustainability work at a private, at a private sector firm, BlackRock. And his deputy is a woman whose entire career has been in community and economic development, right? She has worked at a CDFI, she worked at Shorebank. And so I think both of those individuals are going to be open to new ideas in impact investing and in the community development sector broadly. And I think we should not escape the opportunity. And I'm not suggesting we flood their email inboxes or ring their phones off the hook, but I think strategically meeting with them and talking through where we as a community see the most pressing issues that need to be addressed, it's on us. I think that's incumbent on us, and I think we're going to find open ears there. So yes, it is important for us to be engaging at the federal level.
Great. Amy, any last words, and then I'm going to wrap us.
Well, I'm bullish on the future. I think that we have created a lot of models that work, and I do see shifts happening, and we need those shifts to happen. We need disruptive types of innovation, and I hope that we can all sustain the momentum that's been generated.
Yeah, I would agree. I try to keep my bullish about the future hat on every day. I also just would encourage people just to not be afraid to get involved at all levels. I mean, show up and meet with your local folks, and also just recognize that, as has been shared, in federal government obviously can be a huge force for good, and it needs to become an increasingly necessary one. The other thing I would just say is I think that there is a huge moment. I mean, some of my personally most effective work at the federal level, at least, was done with a quote friendly government. So recognizing that we have this moment where anyone who's elected needs to point to pressure from the outside to do the things to make it safe for them on the inside. I think it's a huge opportunity for us for folks to get really noisy at all levels and really allow for policymakers to show up in the ways that I think a lot of them frankly want to. And they have huge, as we've said, like with public dollars, there should be a smart, a sharp eye on that. So I recognize they're in a specific role, but the more pressure we can create on the outside, but also the more we can normalize around financial activism, the easier it will be, I think, for policymakers to follow.
Great, you heard it here. Get out your pots, bang on them, get loud. I love it. So thank you all so much for joining. The Q&A was just, there's such great questions there we're leaving on the floor. So follow up with each other and with the panelists, have some Zoom coffees, and keep pushing this forward. Really want to thank the panelists for joining and sharing their expertise on behalf of all of the folks at Urban that were engaged in this. And thanks again, everybody, for joining the dialogue. So go forth and do good work.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.